Cambodia, and Thailand. Thank you for attending today's event, which we are proud to organize with the Asian Trade Center. On the agenda today, two presentations on the regional comprehensive economic partnership. We will highlight how important RCEP is for Cambodia. First presentation by Clint O'Connell, partner and tax director at DFDL Cambodia, on the RCEP from the perspective of recent legal and tax developments in Cambodia. And the second presentation by Deborah Ems, executive director at the Asian Trade Center, on the benefits of the RCEP for Cambodia. As usual, we will take questions at the end of the two presentations. You will have the opportunity to post your questions in the chat window. We will direct them to the speakers. Without further ado, Clint, you may start your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Guillaume, for the introduction, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking the time this morning to listen to this update. So really, my role today is just to set the scene for Deborah's presentation and trying to put the RCEP in context with recent developments in Cambodia, which I will try and do over the following slides. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So as you can see, in 2019, when it comes to GDP, Cambodia was tracking pretty well. And then the event, which everybody is aware of, took place in 2020, and we saw quite a dramatic turnaround with respect to the GDP growth. With respect to 2021, this year, the projections for Cambodia ranged from 2.5% to 4%, or just over 4%. And we seem to be probably ending up somewhere in the middle of that range for 2021. But the real expectation and the promise for 2022 is hopefully a move back to the pre-COVID GDP growth, where we'll be looking at a growth in the range of 6 to 7% for Cambodia. Next slide, please. So looking forward, as I mentioned, we have this high expectation for GDP growth in Cambodia. That's supported by the exceptional performance on the vaccine rollout in Cambodia. So we're seeing already on the ground here the reduction in the restrictions on the quarantine for vaccinated visitors, and even to the extent there's only a 3-day quarantine process for vaccinated business visitors. And so that is going to hopefully open up Cambodia and will be the impetus that we need to get the GDP growth going again, looking again for a big year in 2022. During the COVID situation in 2020 and 2021, Cambodia hasn't been idle with respect to improvements, given the drop in the tourism activity in particular. So there has been a number of infrastructure projects that have been carried out in centres such as Siem Reap and Chinookville, and that's all being done now with the optimism for the recovery, which should be hopefully starting from next year. We also see in the region that there are potentially manufacturing shifts from China to Southeast Asia, and with the current issues in Myanmar, we see Cambodia potentially getting some growth from industries moving from Myanmar. Cambodia still has the advantages that it had pre-COVID. So the location of Cambodia and close proximity to most of the major Southeast Asian economies with a port. We have the stable macroeconomic position, as well as the relatively cheap labor force on the ground here. We also do have very supportive government policies. So we've seen through COVID a number of measures that has been taken by the Cambodian government to support businesses over the COVID period. Next slide, please. So the Cambodian government some time ago set out what was called a industrial development policy, and it really was to implement the framework for the future investment for Cambodia and trying to set some key targets. So if we move to the next slide. Okay, so we see the vision very much for Cambodia going to 2025 is transformation and modernization of Cambodia's industrial structure, moving from a labor-intensive industry, which you could see historically with predominantly the garment manufacturing slides, moving more hopefully to a skill-based industry by 2025. And the way that we're looking to do that in Cambodia is to look to connect to regional and global value chains, look to integrate into regional production networks, and also looking to strengthen the competitiveness and improving productivity of domestic industries. Next slide, please. And so one of the key pillars of this, which has been a recent development, is the new investment law for Cambodia, which has received a number of recent updates in the news here. So the investment law has just recently been promulgated by the King, so it is now officially in force, and we are expecting additional regulations, including sub-decrees, to be enacted shortly, but potentially by early next year. Next slide, please. So what does the investment law do? What does the investment law do? Well, it expands on the historical, the previous investment law, in particular with the types of industries that may be available for investment incentives. And in particular, with respect to the topic today, we see these new categories of eligible industries, which include not just agriculture, but SME enterprises, tourism industry, digital industry, investment in education, also investment in health. Next slide, please. And then we have also industries including investment in logistics, green energy, and environmental management and protection. Next slide, please. So the investment incentives that are now offered under this brand new investment law are a little bit the same as the previous investment law, but there are some key differences. So if we move to the next slide, we see now that under this new investment law, we still have the same corporate tax exemption that previously existed, but we also have an additional 6-year period after the completion of the corporate tax exemption period. And during that 6-year period, there is a staggered corporate rate. So for the 2 + 2 + 2, the corporate rate would be gradually implemented from 5% to 10% to 15%. Next slide, please. Okay, so some additional incentives under the investment law include for the qualified investment projects that will be able to access the incentives include export and import exemptions with respect to construction materials, construction equipment, production equipment, and production inputs. So there would be a blanket custom duty exemption with respect to those categories. Next slide, please. For domestic QIPs, they receive a custom duty, excise tax, and VAT exemption on importation of construction materials, construction equipment, and production equipment. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the moving on from the new law on investment, one of the other key developments in Cambodia was the recent ratification of the Cambodia-China Free Trade Agreement, which was ratified on the 9th of September. And so the objective of the Free Trade Agreement is to increase the trade of goods between the two countries by reducing and eliminating tariffs and non-tariff barriers. The Free Trade Agreement extends to a number of sectors, including trade, tourism, investment, transportation, and agriculture. So under the FTA, China will provide duty-free status to up to 90% of imports from Cambodia, whereas Cambodia has agreed to exemptions of up to 90% of its imports from China. And the types of products with these exemptions will apply to include seafood products, garlic, cashew nuts, and dried chili, to name a few. So with the ratification of the FTA, Cambodia hopes to increase its bilateral trade with China to 10 billion USD by 2023, and that's up from the 8 billion that was conducted in 2020. Next slide, please. So from Cambodia's perspective, what does this free trade agreement actually bring? Well, one of the key areas which Cambodia will be able to benefit is with respect to agriculture. And we've seen in 2020 with the impact of COVID that the Cambodian government was trying to pivot away from tourism into the agriculture sector, as that was seen as a stable and reliable base that we could grow with respect to the workers who were previously involved in the tourism industry. And so if we see between January to May 2021, Cambodia exports to China were valued at 558 million, which was already an increase of 56% from the same period in 2020. And we see this demand under the FTA to continue to grow. And we give some examples here with respect to Cambodian mangoes and Cambodia bananas, where you can see that there's been exponential growth in recent times, which will only, we believe, continue to grow under the recently signed FTA. Next slide, please. Next slide, thank you. So the Cambodian-Korean Free Trade Agreement is expected to be signed next week. And similar to the Cambodia-China Free Trade Agreement, it's looking to promote the export or the trade between two countries. Bilateral trade for the first half of this year between Cambodia and Korea was valued at 451 million. Similar to the Cambodia-China FTA, there's a significant lifting of tariffs from both Cambodia and South Korea. If we look at the goods that Cambodia primarily exports to South Korea currently, that includes textiles, footwear, and rubber. With respect to Korea to Cambodia, they primarily consist of automobiles, electronics, and pharmaceuticals. Next slide, please. And finally, we have the most recent development, which is the ratification of RCEP, which occurred just earlier this month. And on that note, it's my pleasure to pass over to Deborah to now give us an overview of RCEP and its impact for Cambodia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Deborah Elms. I head the Asian Trade Center out of Singapore. And I'm really happy to talk about what RCEP means and what it means for Cambodia in particular, because this is a very big responsibility that Cambodia is taking over. As most of you, I'm sure, know, Cambodia becomes the ASEAN chair next year. And part of the ASEAN chair responsibilities will be increased, at least in the short run, to include overseeing the beginning or the launch or the implementation of this mega regional called RCEP. And so I think that's really fantastic that you're all interested in this. No trade agreement works if it sits in a drawer. And so the only way that a trade agreement provides benefits is if businesses who are the primary users of a trade agreement, if they know what's in it, if they understand how to use it, and then if they figure out how to leverage the benefits that are contained in these documents, then they result in real bottom line benefits for companies. If you don't know what you're looking for, then you obviously are not going to just automatically get RCEP benefits. So I'm delighted to have this session this morning or this afternoon to talk about this. So there are 15 countries in RCEP, all 10 members of ASEAN, plus China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. We had most of the negotiations that included India. India dropped out towards the very end of this agreement. And so now we have 15 countries, and we are moving towards entry into force. Next slide. So it will enter into force officially when 6 of the ASEAN members, 6 out of 10, and 3 out of the 5 what we call dialogue partners, which is China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, when they have completed their domestic procedures, then the agreement comes into force. Cambodia, I'm delighted to report, is one of the ASEAN members that is already finished with this process and has agreed to implement the agreement as soon as the trigger is launched. And basically, we're assuming that we will get that critical 9 by November 1st, which means the agreement will start on January 1st, because there's a 60-day delay here. I would also caution you, though, that not all 15 RCEP countries will likely be part of that first wave. As an example, I find it hard to imagine that Myanmar will actually be able to ratify this agreement in any meaningful way in order to be part of the beginning in January 2022. RCEP will look very familiar to many of you who are based in ASEAN and used to using ASEAN's agreements, because the agreement itself followed ASEAN's templates. And so many of them look similar, but not all of them. And critically, although I know most of you on this call are services companies and not goods companies, I will note that there are some changes in trade in goods, manufactured goods in RCEP that is not present in ASEAN. And so you'll need to be a bit cautious and make sure that you are complying with the rules of RCEP instead of just the rules of ASEAN. And I'll mention what that is in just a second. 18 months after we launch, then it's open for potential new members. There'll be a secretariat being set up in the very short run who will manage the day-to-day activities of RCEP. So I think you should view RCEP as it stands as a sort of base. And then over time, like with ASEAN, it will get deeper with more integration and more rules that follow. The texts and schedules are already available. And I put you, in this case, I know it's a very long, and I apologize for the very long web address, but this is the New Zealand website. All of the RCEP countries have their own version of the RCEP texts and schedules. I just find the New Zealand one is nicely documented. So that's why I've sent you to the New Zealand one, but obviously the Cambodian Ministry of Commerce also has a link to the RCEP texts and schedules. Next slide. Now, there's some good news and bad news in RCEP. One real challenge is trade in goods, which is, always been ASEAN's strong suit. And we've always had very good inter-ASEAN rules for managing trade in goods. And we have 5 existing ASEAN +1 agreements. So ASEAN China, ASEAN Korea, et cetera. What they originally thought was, wouldn't it be great for businesses who are often struggling to manage 5 different agreements with 5 different sets of rules, if we could just put them all together, RCEP? Wouldn't that be great? But it turned out to be super complicated, because although ASEAN has agreements with all 5, the 5 did not have agreements with each other. And crucially, Japan had no agreement with China. Japan had no agreement with Korea. The agreement between China and Korea was weak. India was a separate problem altogether. And so the bottom line of this is it's complicated. And I apologize for that up front. But for goods producers, it can take a long time for you to unravel tariff schedules, because we have 37 different schedules. Some of those timelines are very long, so that can be a problem. But, and this is a good news, there's one rule of origin. So once you meet the RCEP rule of origin to produce a product, it can be sent without any new manufacturing changes into all 15 markets in RCEP. That is a very big deal, because right now, you may have to remanufacture product and swap out the content in any particular product depending on its final market. And so having one rule is going to be very helpful for firms. Includes better customs, and crucially as well, one preferential certificate of origin. So you don't have to send your staff to the various trade associations to stamp certificates of origin for all of the different ASEAN +1 agreements. You can just use one document. Compliance costs should go down. There should be more consistency. Next slide. I'm going to give you a few sample illustrations of some of the benefits. We've done a lot more work on this. We've got a couple of booklets out now with the Ministry of Trade and Industry in Singapore, especially services, investment, and IP. We've got a couple of sector-specific booklets on RCEP coming out very soon with the Singapore International Chamber of Commerce, SICC. But let me just give you some sample details about what's in this agreement. So this happens to be for soybeans. You can see that we have the base tariff is the existing tariff, and it varies tremendously from already duty-free or 0% up to 15% for imports of soybeans into Cambodia. All of those, or most of those, let me rephrase that, most of those are going to be cut, some of them over long time horizons. And so you can see in the chart on the right, the variation and the different ways in which countries have scheduled their commitments. Note that there are two boxes in this chart, though, that say U, which is China and Korea. Korea has a super complicated soybean tariff at 487% or 956 won per kilo, whichever is the greater. The U means that there are no new benefits coming from RCEP. So that's unfortunate. We see a few of those U's scattered throughout this agreement. Hopefully over time, they rethink this, they make adjustments. So there are benefits coming, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, sometimes not at all. The next slide, though, shows you why this rule of origin matters. So that was soybeans that I just showed you. On the next slide, shows you the benefits for soybean oil. So while you had to have soybeans grown in RCEP in order to qualify for RCEP benefits, soybean oil has a rule of origin which includes change in chapter classification. I won't go into all the details, but basically for soybeans, if you had a bean and you squish it, it's now changed the chapter. And you can squish soybeans in RCEP and take advantage of soybean oil tariff reductions, which are listed here. You see most of them fall to 0 right away. Those can happen on anybody's soybeans. So you can import soybeans from Brazil if you want to, as long as you're squishing it in Cambodia or in RCEP for sale across the RCEP countries. So there are some new benefits that are coming that require firms to think very hard about what they do, where they do it, and potentially shift up what they're doing, because there is a big difference between, a 9% tariff and 0. Next slide. This just shows you a few, because I know that Cambodia is trying very hard to eliminate, or at least to minimize the dependence on garment manufacturing. But there are some real big benefits actually in RCEP for garments. And so this just shows you, because there was no existing agreement between China and Japan, the swimsuit tariff for Japan had been at 11%, and now it's going down over time. So when we had no benefits, no agreement, now we have an agreement, it gets better. The next slide shows you what happens within ASEAN for the same thing. So this is swimsuit exports from China into ASEAN. You can see, again, lots of variation, but some of those tariffs were extremely high, up to 30%. And dropping over time down to 0. Sometimes, again, the timelines are long, but look at how many of them dropped to 0 on day 1, including some of these very high tariffs. The same thing is true on the reverse, which is swimsuits manufactured in ASEAN that are going out, or swimsuits manufactured in Cambodia that are going out. We have the same kind of variation in tariffs, but the bottom line is that many of those tariffs are reducing, and some of them are reducing from very high levels down to 0, and some of them will do so on January 1st. Next slide. Just to show you what these schedules look like, this is China's tariffs for ASEAN, and you can see the code is on the left, which is the number that corresponds to the thing, the description, swimsuits, and then what are the tariffs? The base rate is what you would pay now with no agreement in place. Year 1, you can see for swimsuit tariffs for ASEAN into China, they drop to 0. On the very first day. So that, I think, is a very good indication of what this looks like. Next slide. to see what another schedule looks like, because they don't all look identical. Again, I'm not in charge. What can I say? Indonesia's tariffs for China also drops and also drops quite quickly, which I think is useful as well. So we have variations in this, but they're broadly similar, all of these different tariff schedules. Next slide. Now, the rules of origin are super important, and I know a lot of you are not in trade and goods. I'm going to try to make this very simple. Basically, what you're trying to do with the rule of origin is you don't want swimsuits that are made in Taiwan or swimsuits that are made in the Caribbean to come into the RCEP economies and then get the same benefits of zero tariffs that swimsuits that are made in Cambodia get. So you have to create what are called rules of origin to make sure that only things that meet those rules that are made or transformed in RCEP qualify for the benefits of RCEP. You don't want other people to sort of sneak in through the back door. So we have to create these rules of origin, and they're in all trade agreements. They can be very hard to use in bilateral trade agreements because you don't have a lot of sources then. If there's only two parties in an agreement, it's very hard to get enough content to make sophisticated products, because you probably don't make, in garments, for example, or swimsuits, you probably don't make the high-tech fabric or the yarn or the thread or the embellishments or the elastic in just two markets. So what happens, what is very useful about RCEP is that now you can add together all of those things across RCEP. And as long as you are making the swimsuit in RCEP for sale in RCEP, you actually can benefit from these lower tariffs that I just mentioned. So the next slide. Actually, I'm going to skip over this one. So the next slide just shows you what the rules of origin are for textiles in particular. And I just want to say that for most Cambodian garment manufacturers, this is fantastic news, because it means that it doesn't matter so much where the content comes from, where the fabric comes from, where the thread comes from, where the elastic comes from, as long as you are transferring it from what it was, fabric, into, in this case, Chapter 61 is where swimsuits are, in Cambodia with sufficient, then you're done. Then you're already RCEP qualifying. So you can import fabric, in this case, from Taiwan, which makes a lot of high-tech swimsuit fabric, even though Taiwan is not a member of RCEP. You can import it into Cambodia, manufacture swimsuits, and send them around RCEP for the benefits that are included in RCEP. So for Cambodian clothing manufacturers, textile manufacturers, this is actually a very important benefit. Next slide. And just to give you some flavor of how great this just shows you for Vietnam's exports of swimwear to Japan. There are 3 different agreements now that are between Vietnam and Japan. RCEP just says change in tariff, change in chapter. So again, it was fabric, now it's a swimsuit, qualifies. Look at the CPTPP one. I mean, that is a nightmare. Then you have to think about what is the product and what was the heading before and what did we add. And the same thing is true in the ASEAN Japan as well. A lot of different kinds of fabrics were excluded from allowing you to be able to take advantage of ASEAN Japan. These rules can be super complicated and they can make it impossible for companies in RCEP to participate. But RCEP, especially for textiles, can be quite simple to use. It was fabric, it's now not fabric, it changed the chapter, it qualifies. Next slide. What doesn't count is you have to do substantial transformation. So you can't just minimally process a good. You can't just sort of stick 2 things together or take a big box and break it into 2 small boxes. You have to actually transform them. And there are rules in RCEP that you need to be carefully following to make sure that you meet those rules of origin. Next slide. I just want to mention this quickly because, again, those people in the goods space really care a lot about these kinds of things. We only need 1 certificate of origin for all of RCEP because the rules are similar, so that should reduce costs and complexity. It should make it faster to go through customs, and there are some specific benefits in there that should be very helpful, like the release of express shipments in 6 hours and release of all shipments within 48 hours. And I just want to mention this one because I think this is very important for Cambodian companies. If you are in the goods space and you can become part of the authorized operators scheme, it will facilitate faster clearance through customs as well. So to the extent that you can get firms into that authorized operator schemes for RCEP, the better, because it will minimize the delays and the cost of clearing customs in RCEP markets. Next slide. Now, I know most of you are services companies, so I want to spend a second on services. Services has always been a weak spot for ASEAN. We have very limited commitments across the ASEAN tent around how we can trade cross-border services. Everything from legal services to consulting to graphic design to, fill in the blank, what kind of services, construction services, et cetera. They have been very hard to do in ASEAN. What RCEP has done, though, is that it should be, for many service companies, a significant expansion in what kinds of services can be delivered. The way that they wrote these commitments down can be really complicated. So again, if you have questions, please contact us about this one. But it's better for a lot of services companies, number one. But there's also a chapter in there that I think is really important for services firms because it helps ensure that we have greater consistency, that we use fewer licensing and qualification requirements as a way to keep out foreign firms or foreign competitors. And I think this is key for services companies, that we limit or we actually ban outright many kinds of performance requirements, like you can no longer demand that only X number of bank branches be set up, unless it's explicitly written in your schedule. But overall, cannot do that anymore. Cannot have requirements on local staff, cannot have local equity requirements. And so over time, I think this is going to be a very big bonus for services companies trying to operate in and around RCEP. The next slide talks about investment. In the investment provisions, I think, are very helpful for firms, and I know I have a bunch of investors and banks on the line, so let me just go into this in just a brief second. Basically, the way that RCEP negotiated investment is different from the way ASEAN typically does this. The default is everything is open. Every investable category is open unless we tell you otherwise. And so now what you're looking for is where are the restrictions or the limitations on investment? And it was difficult to do, but at the end of the day, I think we have a pretty good list of limited restrictions of places where you cannot invest, and everything else is now open for investment. What you do not get in RCEP that is different from many trade agreements is there is no investor protection currently in place. So many of you may be familiar with investor state dispute settlement, especially the lawyers on the line. There is no ISDS in RCEP at this time. So 2 years from the start, we're supposed to start negotiations on investor protections and finish that within 3 years. So 5 years from now, there will be some kind of investor protection in RCEP, but it turned out to be quite challenging to do. The next slide. So the bottom line, and I apologize for taking a bit of time, but sometimes these things, I think you have to walk through them in a little detail or you don't understand what the benefits are. The bottom line is that RCEP, I think, is set to transform trade in the region. Not immediately, but over time, we will start creating goods, services, investing, and moving digital around in Asia for Asia. Now, many of you will say to me, oh, but we already do lots of trade in Asia. And I would say, yes, a lot of trade in Asia, but it's often in raw materials, parts, components for assembly, and then it's exported, whatever the thing is, or even the services tend to be exported to major markets outside of here. So they may be exported to places like the US or the European Union. But what RCEP does is it starts to create a market for final goods and services in Asia for Asia. Now, it will take time. It will be challenging for firms to use, but you can start thinking about Asia as a final destination. And it will be improved over time, I think, as this agreement goes forward. I think there's one more slide, and then I'll wrap up. So I just wanted to mention the sort of bigger picture issues around RCEP. And I think this, again, why Cambodia is so important, because it will be in charge of the launch of this agreement. It was not easy to get here. It took 8 years. There were more than 29 formal rounds. 11 times ministers met for like days on end. Even leaders met for extended periods of time to talk about this. But they got the agreement done. So that's a bit of a miracle in and of itself. And now that we have this platform called RCEP, it creates a place for us to have conversations about trade and economics in Asia that we didn't have before. And so I can imagine that over time, we will start to create Asian rules and Asian standards and Asian procedures, which I think is a very interesting new development. Now, it wasn't part of the original agenda, but as we're all trying to get back past COVID and to build economic recovery, it's going to be very critical in the future. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to discuss any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Clint. One, maybe to get started with a question, one of the first questions that was raised, but you answered already partially to that, Deborah, I guess. What do you think the major opportunities that Cambodia will have in joining RCEP, and more importantly, what are the challenges that Cambodia may face after it comes into force?
So I think it's a bit of a good news, bad news. On the one hand, the good news is that you have access to more markets and much easier access to more markets, including markets that are important. So that's fantastic. The downside is that you have more competition for those markets and you have potentially more competition in Cambodia. But before everybody panics, let me just say, I don't think there are firms that are sort of standing on the border of Cambodia looking, eagerly, licking their lips and saying, we can't wait for RCEP to start to be able to flood the Cambodian market with whatever. So I think there will be a transition phase. It will take some time, especially for trade and goods where the tariff cuts can be limited immediately. But there will be new opportunities. And I encourage firms in particular to start looking at RCEP now, so that when it starts, you're ready to leverage on those opportunities. And where would they be most obvious? Agriculture is one, particularly processed agriculture. And I think that is something that we don't see enough of in Asia. We often just move raw agricultural products and not processed agricultural products. That matters because the value is really in the processing. So this it makes it easier for Cambodian companies to add value to agricultural products and then send them to major markets all around Asia. So agriculture is one area. It's not perfect. There's still some restrictions. Agriculture is always sensitive. Garments, as I mentioned, I think actually gets much better access in ways that are meaningful for garments. Electronics, same thing, I think is useful. And then the underappreciated part of RCEP is the non-goods things. So especially services and investment, where we have had inconsistent rules or no rules really that govern services or investment. And it's been very easy for governments to block foreign firms from providing services or from engaging in investment activities. And I think that is a big new benefit of RCEP that is underappreciated, because people focus too much always in trade agreements on trade and goods because it's easier to see, it's easier to measure, I can count things. So that's why I pay more attention to that. But actually the services and investment provisions, super important. Things like intellectual property rights, really useful, because you can now have your ideas, which is the key part of your business, protected much better and much easier across all of Asia than we had before.
Good, thank you, Deborah. Maybe one question to continue the discussion on this. What would companies have to do to prepare for the implementation of RCEP? How will that change in terms of their operations practically? Maybe Clint, you can take this one. I think you're on mute, Clint.
All right, I think the main thing, Guillaume, is what Deborah emphasized, is the need to familiarize themselves with the content of RCEP, which is, I guess, part of what we're trying to do today, and which we're doing in the future, is to disseminate this information to all of those people who may be affected by this. But one of the points that Deborah mentioned struck me with respect to agriculture. In Cambodia, in particular, we need to, I think, develop our agriculture sector. At the moment, we have kind of standalone small plots of land on which agriculture takes place. So we need to look to take advantage of RCEP and the benefits, for example, to exporting to RCEP and non-RCEP jurisdictions, to have co-ops or combinations, and also increase in the standards so that we are able to better utilize the provisions in RCEP.
All right. And is there a particular industry that Cambodia, you think, Deborah Clint, that Cambodia should not focus on really in the next 5 years, that should not be part of this?
Oh, okay, that's an interesting question. What should you not do? I mean, I don't know that there should be anything that's necessarily off limits, but I think if you are starting some new venture or starting to expand in particular areas, I think you should be mindful of the fact that the competition could be getting hotter for certain kinds of sectors where you are now dealing with Chinese, Korean, Japanese firms in ways that you might not have had to deal with quite so directly in the past. So I think that a bit more awareness of the competition and the landscape for competition is important. But also, again, it's sort of a flip side of this, the opportunities that are now available in new marketplaces to find customers or suppliers, vendors, distributors, whatever, also important, because there are new opportunities that come out of this as well that you may not have paid attention to before because it was too difficult. It was too expensive. It was too difficult. Too many challenges, too many clear obstacles to doing business in particular markets. Some of that will be going away under RCEP. Some of it will go away quickly. Some of it will take some time. But that provides new opportunities, for all kinds of services, investment, goods manufacturing, et cetera, in the region.
Okay, we mentioned among the sectors we mentioned, of course, goods is probably the first thing that comes to mind. What about free trade and free movement of labor, and particularly free movement of labor? Is there any provision in the RCEP arrangement? No.
No. So because this is highly sensitive across most of the Asian economies, there is nothing in the agreement on movement of people, movement of workers, except there is a business mobility chapter, which may help firms who have operations in multiple jurisdictions move some of their staff more easily, because you have more transparent and clear rules on, for example, intercorporate transferees, but not for all of the 15 markets. And whatever is in RCEP can be overridden by the immigration authorities in different markets as well. So it's a limited amount of movement of people. Some may have new benefits coming from RCEP. So if this is of interest to you, please look at that business mobility chapter. But in general, it's not a high priority right now because it's too sensitive for too many markets in Asia.
Okay, I think we have two more questions from the participants. One, I think you already partially responded or indirectly responded, Deborah, on what's the perception of the Cambodian government on RCEP? You said that Cambodia was particularly up to speed and that the ministries have already prepared themselves for the implementation.
Well, there's always challenges with implementation, and particularly that's true for developing economies because the capacity is always limited. I mean, Cambodia has some fantastic officials, but they don't have a lot of officials. So trying to get capacity across all of the different and relevant ministries and agencies can be difficult. And that's true for Cambodia, it's true for most of the developing economies. So there will need to be more capacity building for government officials. But what I think is really, for me, very heartening about RCEP and Cambodia is the enthusiasm that the government is showing for RCEP in particular, in sending, first of all, top people to negotiate in the first place, but then also in very quickly moving towards ratification. The government has held a lot of capacity building seminars since RCEP closed to try to build that awareness among different ministries and agencies about what is involved in RCEP. And so I think all of that is very good news. Again, the job is never done, so it's always helpful to continue to do that process. What is the struggle, or what is a struggle that Cambodia, like most of the governments, are going to have is how do you get businesses to understand the benefits, and how do you get them to leverage those benefits? That is always difficult. And so I'm not sure how much the government itself will be able to do on this. Maybe they'll do more. But it's important to have private industry sessions like this one to educate firms that are busy in Cambodia to use this agreement.
Okay, thank you for the recommendation. Maybe one or two last questions. One from Singapore. To what extent might Cambodia's bilateral FTAs with China and Korea, for instance, and perhaps other RCEP members in the future complement or detract from the implementation of RCEP, given the limited domestic capacity?
That is a great question. So I was on a call yesterday, in fact, with the chief negotiator from Cambodia for RCEP, and he was asked this very similar question. And he said, you know, what we've done in our bilaterals in particular is we've gotten additional key items for us that we could not build into the RCEP schedules. So there are some additional benefits coming from their perspective, at least, in these bilateral agreements that might not have been able to be captured in RCEP because it's too big and it's too, the competition can be too intense. So you try to then build in sort of complementary bilateral agreements to add benefits in areas that are not otherwise covered. So I think that's the idea behind the Cambodian government. I think that's very useful. I noted particularly, and I'm happy to refer back to Clint on this one, I noted that you have coverage in these bilaterals, especially with China and Korea, that's at 90% useful. But a crucial issue always with a trade agreement is what is the 90%, and more urgently, what is the 10% that is not covered? If the thing that you care about is in the 10%, then you get no benefits from the bilateral or even from RCEP. So you have to think hard about what is it that I want to do. Crucially, in a bilateral, again, how am I going to produce the product if it's a product? Because if you can't meet the rules of origin between just Cambodia and Chinese content or Cambodian and Korean content, having the benefit is not as useful because you can't actually take advantage of it. So you should view them as parallel and not identical. In some cases, it will be a bit more confusing than it needs to be, but that's just kind of life.
Okay, thank you. Clint, anything to add to that on the FTA?
No, I completely agree with Deborah that they complement and overlap each other. With respect to the items that are missing from the tariff elimination and the FTAs, we can definitely provide more detail to those who are interested after the webinar today. Thank you.
All right. Maybe there was just one last question, maybe a bit more general, and there might be different ways of understanding it or responding to it. Mentioning the research, a research that said that Cambodia would benefit from RCEP by untapped export markets. Could you explain the operational approach that Cambodia may benefit from RCEP?
So I think there's a number of ways, again, that I already mentioned, but I'll repeat them, where I think Cambodia could benefit. And I go back to agriculture for a moment. You know, I think Clint highlighted some of the struggles that the Cambodian agricultural sector has had. It has tended to be in the production of raw materials rather than in the processing of those materials for a variety of reasons, sometimes because of barriers in big markets. What I think is a potential opportunity coming is the ability to marry RCEP investment in different kinds of agricultural supply chains, including new farming techniques or farming processing methods, new investments in warehousing, cold storage, cold chain, et cetera, that might potentially allow Cambodia to move up in a different area of the agricultural value chains and supply more products to RCEP economies, because the RCEP economies they can be agricultural powerhouses in their own right, but they often make different kinds of products. So the demand for food and agricultural products in general continues to go up. And I think this is one of those ways you could leverage RCEP to marry that experience, the money, the investment opportunities with Cambodia's own natural resources and abilities to create some really interesting new synergies. Does it happen tomorrow? No. So this is one of those areas where it will have to start now, and then over time, I think we're going to see the benefits of this. And it's not just in agriculture, it's in a whole lot of areas where, again, if you do this well, then you can leverage opportunities and actually do better over time.
Okay, thank you, Deborah. The last question, will Cambodia benefit from ecotech, economic cooperation technology assistance, and in which sector and how?
That's a good question. So there is an ecotech chapter in RCEP. Again, it follows a sort of ASEAN model. The advantage of RCEP, again, to me, is that you have 5 important dialogue partners. Most of them, especially the Australians, the Japanese, the Koreans, have robust aid projects that in part will be built around capacity for RCEP. So my suggestion to Cambodia is that the Cambodian government design a list of projects that they would like to have funded, and that they quickly submit those requests to the dialogue partners so that they are part of that ecotech capacity building that is likely to start, but it needs to be sort of recipient driven. So Cambodia itself needs to come forward and say, these are the three projects at the top of our list that we would like funded in the next 6 months, let's say. And then you can actually kickstart this capacity building projects in areas that you think make sense. So again, one obvious one for me could be building better infrastructure of all different kinds. Infrastructure doesn't just mean roads, but infrastructure to support the agricultural business, or you fill in the blank what it is that you think matters.
Okay, I said that was the last question. In fact, yes, one last question. I promised that would be the last one. An interesting question. Could you please highlight 1 or 2 things that could make RCEP fail?
Oh, fail. Okay, so always there's politics. Politics was a challenge to negotiate this agreement, because you may have noticed over the last few years, at certain points, China and Australia could not speak to one another. South Korea and Japan could not speak to one another. They could not be in the same room with one another. But in RCEP, they managed to sit literally side by side because it's alphabetical. So I think that gives me hope that although we're going to have, and we will probably continue to have, political and potentially security challenges that are in the region that continue to bubble, we may be able to manage through that in RCEP, but it's definitely a risk. Politics can impede trade and economics. So I would say that for me is the number 1 risk. The number 2 risk is that this somehow RCEP as a whole gets, second one would be RCEP gets caught in some larger geopolitics, again, back to politics about who's with who, and this could get very complicated. And then the third risk is much of failure for me is much more depressing in a way, which is just that governments just don't do what they need to do, and they don't actually deliver on the promises, and businesses don't pay attention, and then it exists, but nobody uses it. So it kind of fails through neglect.
Okay. Thank you for your valuable contribution and all these responses. it's time to close this very interesting webinar. Thank you to all the participants. Please complete our feedback survey. You see on the slide a link that you can click on to access the survey, and we'll look forward to seeing you or hearing from you. If you have questions, please feel free to send us emails with your questions, and we'll look forward to seeing you again on our next events. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.